Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is Syd Yang. Syd is a mixed-race, queer, non-binary healer, writer, intuitive artist, and healing justice organizer. They weave together magic, prayer, and intention as an energy healer in the world through their practice, Jaguar Healing Arts. As someone who lives with depression and anxiety and has recovered from eating disorders, their work finds resonance in the stories we each hold at the intersection of memory, body, sexuality, and mental health. Syd's work is rooted in Buddhist practice, is liberation-minded, and trauma-informed. Today, Syd shares about the discovery of energy and spiritual healing work on their path to recovering from bulimia. We talk about the ways our bodies hold stories and the power in sharing and releasing them. Syd also talks about their intimate relationship with the natural world and all the ways it can support us. To learn more about Syd's work, visit jaguarhealingarts.com. Hi, Syd. Welcome to the Queer Spirit.
Thank you for having me.
So, Syd, I always like to start out by asking people how they first started doing the work that they do. So I wonder if you could tell us the story of how you first began your spiritual and energy healing work.
Yeah, so I feel like how I started, there were lots of mini fits and starts and a lot of different entry points in how I started walking down the path as an energy healer. I think for me, it all began in the work that I was doing, my own personal healing work, working with healers, working with energy healers, working with asomatic therapists in particular, where I realized that this approach of looking at my whole body as an energetic entity, as a spiritual being, not just this mind or like intellectual being that just resided in my head, that it's so much more than that. I realized like what was happening is all of a sudden things were moving and things were healing and things were shifting in my own body, in my own life, in my own existence, in my own experience. And things that I was able to move through, especially around recovery of an eating disorder, like it blew my mind. And like things that I hadn't been able to move through traditional therapy as a singular modality, things were shifting. And I was being able to be in new relationship with my body. And I was like, what are these modalities? And they were really introduced to me by friends who are like, you're struggling, Syd, try this. Or this has really helped me, try this, connect to this healer. So there was a lot of spaces, just curiosity of not knowing, of just being like, I'm willing to try anything because I'm also in a place where the eating disorder and my addiction were so deep that I was like, I have to figure out how to get out of this chasm. And in order to do that, I was willing to try anything at that point. And I just happened to find the right healers. And like through that process, it was so transformative. The modalities, the approach, the kind of like the worldview that was offered, that over time, I was like, this is amazing. Maybe I should personally start studying to better understand what is energy healing, better understand somatics and how the body works and how we hold stories and like the cellular pieces of our body and how we hold histories, ancestral histories, and like how that shows up when I move in a certain way or I get stuck in a certain shape. Like, what is that? What's behind all of that? Right. And so I started studying with a couple of teachers, both when I lived in San Francisco and then also here in LA. And it just opened up this space. And it wasn't studying as a way of like, I'm going to be a healer. That's my path is what I'm going to do. But really, I just wanted to better understand what was happening, what happened, and this idea of being able to really move to the other side of recovery with an eating disorder that had been with me for decades, that I thought would be with me forever. I'm like, there's something that shifted. What is that piece? And what is that intersection of energy work, being embodied or trusting the embodied experience, as well as spirituality and meditation and trusting things that I can't even see or know and being in that space of faith, right? Then what could that look like if I could understand that better in my own body and move that into my own spiritual practice, inform the ways that I was in relationship to other people, in relationship to the earth? Could that shift who I was in the world? And could that actually help me have a better sense of who I needed to be in the world? So I would say there was two moments where things really shifted for me around possibility of walking down a path of being a practitioner and holding space for other people. And the first one, I had just gone through a breakup. Well, I guess it was about the same time. So I had just gone through this breakup and everything just didn't make any sense, right? Because breakups. And a friend of mine at one point I'd been reaching out to her and kind of talking through some stuff and venting. And she was like, okay, you're really intuitive. And I'm like, well, yeah, I know that. And she's like, no. You know that you're really good. You're always saying things and guiding people and like holding these pieces that people don't see. You just like, they just come out of you and they change people's life. They've changed my life. And I'm like, okay, sure. That's how I see the world. I don't think it is anything special. And she's like, no, this is special. Like you hold something that other people don't. You have a perspective and a gift. What if you did more with that? I'm like, but that's just who I am. Like, I don't know that's not a profession or a thing to be offering in the world. That's who I am in the world, right? Just I'm a person. And she's like, no. I think you should take a look at this. And so what came out of that is like through a lot of meditation and talking to some of my spiritual teachers, they're like, well, maybe this is your path, right? To really lean into what could that look like, or what could a path, if I directed myself on a path of like, okay, my work is to be a healing practitioner. What then could that look like, right? And the other thing that happened right after, so though that question was sitting there, and then the other thing that happened is I went to New Orleans for like 2 weeks and to visit some friends, but I had also lived there. I went to grad school there. And so in many ways, there's a lot of community and home there. And when I was there, I was like, okay, I'm going to find a healer who doesn't know anything about me, knows absolutely no history, has no relationship to me or the people that I know. And I want to ask, what is opening up for me? I want to ask this question, is my path to be a healing practitioner, is my path to serve and be of service to others in this capacity? And so I ended up finding somebody, and it was like this, finding a healer is always weird, I find, and found one that resonated. And I met with him, and it was all of these moments of intersections and synchronicities that I could never have imagined or planned for, or even like come up with. And what came out of that is at one point, he took me through this journey meditation into this like trance meditation. And what came out of that for me was this like really resounding, yes, this is my path. And what I saw in that meditation were a lot of my elders, spiritual teachers, some that I knew, some that I would eventually meet later on down the road, who were all greeted me and said, we're waiting for you. We're waiting for you. You are a part of this. And it was so humbling. And it was so like, oh, hell no, both of those in my body. But there was an affirmation in this that I have to keep seeking. I have to keep moving forward. That was the beginning. So that was 2011, I think. So I've been doing a lot of study, but that's really where I stepped in to do more intentional study with my teachers, with my spiritual teachers, to be able to then be a practitioner and to be of service forward.
Wow, that's quite a story. It's interesting to hear your story because I resonate with a lot of what you shared, and, this idea of just starting out on your own healing path and trying to seek out a variety of different kinds of practitioners to see what's going to work for you. And I'm curious, from your own experience, did you sort of work with one person and sort of work on this one thing and then say, okay, now I need to go work on this thing and find another person? Or did you work with the same person, or did the practitioners refer you to another practitioner? Like, how did that sort of story piece together for you?
In regard to like my studying and being in practice, or my personal healing?
Your personal healing.
Oh, yeah. My personal healing I feel like it's a very up and down, in and out type of journey of finding the right healers or the right practitioners. And for many years, it was trying to find the right therapist, right? And I was like, I have an eating disorder. I deal with depression and anxiety. I need a therapist in a certain model, in a certain structure. And I felt like that was my only option, given what I had been told or taught. That took me a really long time to find somebody. And nobody quite fit. And so I stopped seeing a therapist and then went through another breakup, because that's what happens. Everything in terms of my eating disorder came back with a vengeance at this point in my life. My first reaction was, oh, I need to see a therapist again, or I need to find another therapist. And I realized at that point, I'm like, I'm just going to talk myself out of it. Like, I'm in this addiction so strong that actually talking about it is not going to serve me. I need to find something else. I feel like this eating disorder, this addiction is like so in the cells of my body So who can I help, or who can help me like extricate from the cellular like components and fabric of who I am? And that's when I started talking to friends, because I'm like, does that person even exist? Like, what kind of work is that? And at the time I wasn't familiar with energy healing. And to me, like, somebody said, oh, go see a Reiki healer. I'm like, no, they're just too woo-woo. They're just a little too, no, yeah, a lot of judgments around that. So I'm not going to do that. Finally, a friend sat me down and she's like, you're really struggling. Let me call this spiritual healer that I work with and see if she's open to working with you and can hold stuff around an eating disorder. And then a day later, she called me and she's like, yeah, she's in. And I set up an appointment. And so what that started is I worked with this healer for about 5 years, often twice a week, mostly once a week. She does craniosacral, she does somatic body work, she does Reiki and energy healing, she does intuitive work, pretty much like the whole gamut. And she does really deep spiritual work. And about 2 years into working with her, where I wasn't really talking much about what was happening, but she was just working on the body and working with the soma and working with what was happening in this, what was being held in this physical being. I was like, I think I'm ready now for a therapist. And she referred me then to a therapist who I ended up working with for probably about 10 years. And she, somatic therapist, Jungian in her approach, and just was everything that I needed a therapist to be in ways that I'd never experienced traditional therapy before. Mm-hmm. So I felt held, I felt seen, I felt acknowledged. She introduced me to the ideas of harm reduction for eating disorder recovery. And I had never put those two and two together. And all of a sudden it was like this light bulb going off in my head and being like, oh, this makes so much sense, that if I can apply a harm reduction approach and model in theory to my own eating disorder recovery, my own this addiction, what could happen? And that was really kind of like the like cracking open of a recovery that stuck. Mm-hmm. And so I worked with her, and there was other people that were maybe that I would see for very short-term work that was referred by other friends, or my therapist, I think, had referred me to one person at one point, but I really stuck with those healers. And then when I moved back to LA about 10 years ago, stayed with my therapist, and then slowly found other healers in the area that I resonated with, that I would build a relationship with and be like, oh, okay, I have trust. I feel there's resonance here. I feel that you can hold me, and I feel safe being vulnerable and open and cracking open mm-hmm. before them. And so that's really where I am now. There are a number of folks that I'm in mutual relationship with, other healers, that I think these are relationships that over the years we've nurtured together, especially as queer healers and trans healers. How do we hold that space of mutual care, but also being able to share our gifts and hold each other in this shared and complementary way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you've talked a lot about really working with the body and the way that your story is being held in the body. And this is something that, I've had other people on the show, and we've talked about the way that our body holds stories. And you say that our stories live in our bodies and that will set us free. And you've written this book. And I wonder if that part of you writing this book about your bulimia story is a way of setting yourself free.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that telling stories that are supposed to be shameful, or that are supposed to be taboo, or that are supposed to be not talked about is a really powerful way to reduce or minimize their power in the ways that they can shut us up. And so how that looked for me was, for years, I never talked about having an eating disorder because there was so much shame around that, or so much taboo around that. And so much like if it came up, the people are like, oh my gosh, I'm so worried about you. And I'm like, no, this is just how I survive. Like, it's fine. And that you don't need to like be so worried about me. I'm just naming something that's happening. And to really shift that, and realizing for me that if I don't tell my stories and I don't pull out what's inside here, then it's still going to have this power. That's that power of silence, of shame, not good enough, right? There's something wrong with me. It's still going to like take up so much space and weigh me down and keep me quiet and keep me small. And I also realized, as I was starting to do more writing and sharing my stories out, is that as I was going through my recovery, one of my practices in the harm reduction model was to actually invite others in my community in to what I was going through, and to share my stories on a one-on-one basis, so that I wasn't being in secret all the time. And what I found in that, there was 2 people in my community that I were really close with that I pulled in and kind of like started building this, like, let me not have any secrets between us and see how that can shift my relationship to my body and to my eating, is that both of them then disclosed to me that they had similar stories around eating disorders. And that blew my mind. That here, what I saw are like these powerful queer people who are like holding powerful political and social and like community space, are also having and holding similar secrets and pain that I was having in my own body. And that if I had not said anything, we would never have connected that resonance. We would never have been able to do the profound, like, shared healing work that we eventually did together, because it was being silenced, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what came out of that for me was like this urgency, or this like really strong calling, that if I can't step up and share my stories and really pull those out, then I am in effect also keeping other people silent at the same time. And in that, we're all hindering each other from the liberation that our bodies and that our souls and our spirits are seeking.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, sharing the stories out and like that getting free is not just about me personally feeling more free in my body, but it's really about how to lean in and practice and generate collective liberation for all of us in our shared communities. And I really mean that is, yes, for everybody, but specifically for queer and trans folks and folks of color, where our stories, even within the recovery world and within the world around eating disorders and self-harm, are not centered and are not lifted up and are not heard, so that when we go into those spaces for help or for support, we feel isolated or erased, or that we don't belong. And that was my history and my experience of being in spaces. I'm like, well, there's this heteronormative, cisnormative narrative of who I'm supposed to be. And if I'm recovered, I look and sound and feel in this certain way. And I'm like, well, I'm never going to look and sound and feel in that way. So this isn't working for me, or maybe I shouldn't. Recovery's not for me, right? And so I had to shift that. And a part of what I feel is like my work, or my work as a healer, my work as a queer healer, my work as a practitioner in this moment, is to hold up the possibility that what feels impossible in this moment can and absolutely is possible. And part of sharing my stories is to share that what felt so impossible for me, which was a life without an eating disorder, that felt absolutely impossible, became possible through the process of sharing out my stories, of connecting and being in relationship in a more vulnerable way with others, but also by leaning into spiritual practices and spiritual communities that allowed for the wholeness of who I am and the wholeness of who we all are to exist and thrive and be nurtured. And so for me to share the stories out, and why I wrote the memoir, is specifically for that, is so that we're building bridges and erasing the ways silences us and shame separates us.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm also really hearing in that is the power of vulnerability and authenticity, and the power of coming out. As queer people, we come out, but then there's so many other ways that we can continue to come out, by coming out about our trauma and our wounding, and sharing that in community, and then knowing that we're not alone, and letting other people know that they're not alone too. And I also really hear the power in doing that as a healer, as a teacher, as a leader, that you're saying, hey, I went through this process too, and I'm not as perfect as maybe you think that I am. And there are ways that you can heal, and let's help you find the way to do that.
Yeah, I do a lot of work these days with, do one-on-one work as an energy healer, and work with folks specifically around the ways that self-harm and eating disorders show up as imprints of trauma, as reactions to what's happening in the world, right? As expressions of survival. And the piece that feels so salient or important, especially in the sessions and folks that I work with now, is this piece around permission. And that it's not about there's anything wrong with us because we have these survival mechanisms, or because we have ways of coping that maybe are not socially accepted, or that we have trauma in our bodies that exists and shows up and like is what navigates with us as we move through the world and our relationships. And to give folks the space and the permission to step back and be like, there's nothing wrong. And there's nothing wrong in this moment of how you're surviving, how you're reacting, how your body is making choices. And there's nothing wrong in the ways that we hold our own stories, right? And for each of us, how we hold our stories or how we've internalized the stories is going to be different. And so where's that permission to show up in that uniqueness or that complexity or those different intersections of what it looks like to be human and to hold trauma, because we're healing in every single moment. And one of the pieces that has been coming up really recently is this idea that we're not supposed to have trauma responses. We're supposed to be these positive, like very like, we're good. I don't have any like attachment issues. Like everything's great.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so much of that is also elevated by what's happening with social media and like the prevalence of that, of just like memes and like short quotes and like, and the ways that what's supposed to be like supportive and motivating has the flip side of that, of being shaming and being silencing of people's experience or minimizing or erasing of people's experiences. And so I see that a lot in around body positivity of like, just love your body's great, you're so beautiful. And what I find is like, well, what about the folks who are like, but I actually don't feel that. So then there must be something wrong with me because I can't access this ideal or this quote, right, that I see on Instagram. And so the work that I do is being like, okay, there is no ideal. There is this place of where you are right now. How do we accept what is in this moment? And if what is in this moment is you fucking hate your body, okay, let's be with that right now, because there's no shame in that. If we can take out the shame, if there's take out the judgment, then we can just be with what is. And if we can be with what is, and if in this moment you hate yourself or you can't trust your body, then we're able to move from an energetic perspective. We're able to rebalance and reset what is creating those blocks or those feelings of impossibility. And so I work from that place of like, let's come back to the moment, or let's come back to the what is, erase the shame, erase the judgment, and then see what's possible, as opposed to wanting to have this aspirational ideal of where we're supposed to be or how we're supposed to be in relationship with ourselves.
Yeah. And I know that in the work that I do with people, I don't work with people around body issues per se, but with other stuff, anxiety or self-hatred in other kinds of ways, there is power in just getting a little bit uncomfortable with sitting with that and really just exploring what emerges out of that instead of trying to run away from it all the time.
I think the not running away for me has been like a huge practice. I started a meditation practice and first started studying through a Zen practice about, I want to say almost 20 years ago. And it really stuck for me about 15 years ago. And that's really where it became like a daily practice. And now it's so much a part of who I am and how I breathe and how I move through the world that not having it, it doesn't make sense to me. But for me, having a contemplative practice, that allowed me that space to be with myself in stillness and in observation and noticing, as opposed to judging and trying to fix. It's not an easy practice. It still is not an easy practice all these years later, but it's a really fundamental practice for me because it gives me that distance to be like, I can notice, I can see, I can witness without having to fix or change or run away from. And so meditation in that form or in a Buddhist form may not work for everybody, but the fundamentals of being in contemplation, finding that place of stillness where we're able to witness ourselves from a place of observation, from a place of non-judgment, that's really critical. That if we're going to move through places of pain or places of self-harm or practices of addiction, that we have to be able to have a little bit of space or a little bit of stillness to be like, how can I see myself in a place of compassion and witnessing and holding, so that there's that moment when the body or the heart cracks open just a little bit, and that creates that space for change or a new path or a new possible way of being to emerge.
So I have a feeling this might lead into the answer of my next question, but it may not, so that's okay. But in the description of your book about bulimia, you say that animals and trees helped you heal your relationship to your body. And I wonder if you can share more about how these aspects of nature helped you with that.
Yeah, when I was writing my book, so the book is called Release, the Bulimia Story. And when I was writing it, what emerged were all of these stories of the ways that I talk to animals. And so there's talking animals in the book. There are talking like tree nymphs. There are like trees and sky and earth, like all of those pieces are characters within the stories. And as I was writing them, I realized I'm like, well, this is just how I see the world. Even as a kid, like I would always talk to the animals or talk to the trees as if they were part of my immediate kind of friend circle. And it just makes sense in that realm or in that way for me. As I was going through my recovery, where that showed up was this deep understanding that I am not separate from, but I am connected to natural cycles in the world or the ways that the natural world operates. And so oftentimes it was looking at or looking towards nature as a metaphor or as a teacher of how things regenerated, of how animals were in relationship to each other. One story I can share really briefly is this piece around like trusting my body and feeling I'm so different. Because I remember one day watching a bunch of cats outside, and all of them have different body shapes and different color and different ways of moving. And one of them actually at the time was wounded and didn't have the same mobility as some of the other cats. And as I was just watching them, there was just this way of just like, there was no judgment of like, oh man, that cat has stripes and I don't, or that cat's tail is fluffier than mine. They were just like, we exist and coexist and this is what creates the beauty in the world. And so for me, that fundamentally shifted my sense of my body in the context of a natural world, because as humans, we're part of the natural world. And so as I could hold that, it just created new possibilities around how I could hold my body in spaces that didn't necessarily reflect me or mirror me. And especially as a person who is non-binary and is not necessarily feminine presenting and all of those things, it felt liberating to have that reflected back by the natural world. And then the other piece in that is growing up, I grew up in an evangelical community, and this idea that the only answer was in God or was in the Bible around my body or gender or femininity or expressions of all of those things, that I had to look and sound a certain way. What I learned by like just resonating with animals in the natural world and plants and trees is that things are a lot messier than this ideal, right? Things actually made more sense to me. Things like die, things break, things are like decompose and are stinky and all of those things, right? And yet beauty emerges every single time. And so to me, that just made more sense to me as something that I could believe in or resonate with or want to be a part of. And so that's why it comes up so much in the book. And I tell people that, yes, there are talking squirrels and there's like all these talking birds, and yet it's not a made up story. That is literally how I've moved through the world and continue to move through the world. That's a true story. It feels fantastic, but it's real. And that is a part of how I engage spiritually, and it's how I engage holistically as a healer as well with others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also really believe in the connection with nature and being able to learn from the examples that it brings to us. You know, as you said, like being able to see cats that were all of different shapes and sizes and colors and abilities, or, you know, looking at, you know, a field of flowers and seeing how, even though it may be all the same flower, they all look a little bit different. They don't have to be the same. And I think that if we really tune into that, what nature is telling us, that we can really go, oh, there's so much here for me to learn just about myself and my humanity and my place in the world.
Yeah. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with us. At any point, there's nothing wrong.
Yeah.
And the one thing I would add about the animal piece is like, if you take the time to sit and just watch pigeons and look at them, every single one of them is different. Mm-hmm. The fascinating thing about pigeons, and every single one is colored differently and actually has a personality that's different. And that is a part of like, for me, of like, oh, not one of those pigeon is wrong, which means not 1 ounce of me is wrong either. This is my fullness. This is my expression. And so where do I find my place? Because there is place, right? Mm-hmm. Whether or not somebody says it's allowed that place exists. There is that place because I exist, because you exist. That means there is belonging inherently in the world for us.
When you bring these ideas to the clients that you work with, how did they respond?
I think they like it or it works or it resonates. And the reason I say that is that I work regularly with clients. So I work with folks either once a month or twice a month, and it's ongoing cumulative work. And I have folks who have been with me for years and constantly am getting new inquiry for folks to do work with me. People have shared stories of how doing this work together and being seen and held in an expansive and permissive way has led to deep transformation in themselves and their relationships, but also in the ways that they're in relationship to their own bodies. And it's humbling. It's really humbling because so much of the work that I do is spiritually based and is energetic based. So it's not this like, you do X and then you do Y and then this is the next step. It's not systematic or linear. It's mystical and magical, and it is faith-based, and it's trusting in the unknown in a way that can't always be quantified. And yet folks walk out of this work completely transformed and changed and rejuvenated and regenerated in the ways that I too experienced and continue to experience by doing this work with other healers.
Wonderful. So Syd, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
That is a good question. There are so many. So I will name the person I'm working with currently right now, Rowan Coughtry. And Rowan is a queer trans healer who does a lot of work around spirituality, sex liberation, and is based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And I personally am doing Rowan to hold those spaces within my own body around desire and trust.
Okay. So Syd, where can people find you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, so I have two websites. One is jaguarhealingarts.com, and that's my primary website and the primary healing practice that I maintain. And then also specifically to the work around recovery and body liberation, releasebulimia.com. And that's a project of Blue Jaguar Healing Arts.
Okay. Well, I will have those links in the show notes so people can find them there as well. Well, Syd, thank you for being here and sharing more about your work and your story and all the ways that you're bringing transformational healing to the world.
Thank you so much for having me.
I work with many queer folks who struggle to get their needs met or who suffer from having their boundaries violated by others. Because you may not have been cared for the best, you might have a hard time identifying your needs. Or because you have been violated or bullied, you might not completely understand where exactly your boundaries are. If you'd like some help exploring your needs and building more resilient boundaries, head over to my website and download the free guide, Needs, Boundaries, and Self-Care Support for Queer Folks. This is a short introduction to help you start to shift and change your relationship to yourself and others, and to feel more safe and resourced day to day. So just head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/needs to download your free guide today. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.